The ring was still warm from her finger. I know because I picked it up off the bathroom counter and held it in my palm like it would explain something, like the gold of it would tell me where my twin had gone, and why she had left 4 hours before her own wedding without a word, and with nothing except the clothes on her back and one small suitcase she had apparently packed 3 days ago. I was still holding it when the phone lit up. Her phone, Briar's name on the screen. The message said, "Be down in 5. I ordered coffee. Miss you already." I stared at the screen for a long time, then I went down. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. The hotel was called the Alderton, and it sat on a bluff above the water with the particular confidence of a building that has been beautiful for a very long time and has never needed to announce it. My family was not old money. We were not any kind of money. We were a yellow house in the suburbs and a mother who believed in the luck of the color, and 2 daughters who shared a room until they were 17 and made promises to each other in the dark about maid of honor speeches that would make the whole room cry. I had been working on the speech since February. I had been to the Alderton once before this weekend, the previous Christmas, when Mira insisted on booking rooms for everyone because it was her and Briar's first Christmas as an engaged couple, and she wanted the kind of backdrop that made everything feel real. The Alderton had felt real. The stone lobby with its low fires and the massive windows overlooking the coast. The dining room where the chef did something with halibut that made my mother close her eyes. The corridors with their old wood and the particular smell of linen and cedar that I had associated since that Christmas visit with the feeling of being very precisely in the wrong place for entirely the right reasons. I had developed that association at Christmas because that was when I first understood, in the specific and unavoidable way understanding arrives when you have been refusing to look at something for several months, what I was actually dealing with. Briar Calloway had come down to breakfast on Christmas morning in a dark sweater and an old pair of jeans, her hair loose. She always kept it back in professional or social settings. Always, and I had noted this as a detail that told me something, though I had not yet decided what I was going to do with the telling. She sat across from me at the breakfast table while Mira was still asleep, and my mother was somewhere orchestrating something festive. She poured coffee for both of us without asking whether I wanted some, the way you pour coffee for someone when you have already determined that the question is redundant. We talked for 40 minutes about the architectural history of the Alderton's original 1903 wing, which she had been reading about because she was an architect and could not visit a building without needing to understand its structure. The morning light was doing something generous to the room. She spoke about load-bearing walls with the same precision she brought to every subject, and I looked at her across the table and understood, in the place where the honest things live, that I was in significant trouble. I had managed the trouble the way I managed everything, by building a structure around it, maintaining that structure with care, and never speaking of its existence to anyone, including myself. 18 months of that. 18 months of family dinners and joint holidays and the birthday party in June, and every weekend visit where Mira came to stay with me in the city and brought Briar, and I had been the still one, the one who stood a little further back, the one who watched, and was very good at making the watching look like it was simply her nature. Because it was her nature. Because she had always been quieter than Mira, the still twin, the one who knew how to stop. I had gotten very good at stopping. The wedding weekend arrived on a Friday in October, and I drove up through fog and then through the sharp gold of coastal autumn light and checked in and told myself that this was the last large thing. After the wedding there would be dinners and visits, but there would no longer be events of this specific magnitude, requiring me to stand in close proximity to Briar Calloway for 2 consecutive days while managing the internal load-bearing structure of 18 months. The rehearsal dinner was at 7 on Friday evening in the hotel's private dining room. It had been dressed in the understated way that Briar's family's aesthetic produced: ivory candles, dark greenery, no excess, everything chosen with the instinct that the right thing in the right place requires nothing else. Mira's fingerprints were in the warmth of it, the small personal details alongside the larger precision, because Mira's great gift had always been finding the warmth inside any structure someone else had built. Briar's toast was what I thought about afterward for longer than was useful. She stood with her glass and said, without preamble or performance, that she had proposed to Mira in the middle of an argument about kitchen cabinets. She had been describing her reasoning for a particular hardware choice, and Mira had looked at her with that expression that meant she was about to say something devastating in the most gentle possible way, and Briar had thought, I am going to spend my entire life having this argument with this specific person, and I cannot imagine wanting anything else. So she proposed. Right there, in the kitchen, with the cabinet samples on the counter and the argument unfinished. The room laughed the warm and knowing laugh of people who recognized honesty when they heard it. I laughed too, from 2 seats down, and made eye contact with my twin over the table, and grinned the grin that meant something specifically twin-shaped. And I felt the structure hold, and felt the holding of it, and decided to call it enough. June Briar's oldest friend, who had known her since college and had the warm, grounded attentiveness of someone who had been paying close attention to Briar Calloway for 15 years and had developed, through that attention, a complete and specific understanding of her, leaned across the table after the toast and said to me, "Lo, she means it, you know. Every word. Briar does not say things she does not mean." I said, "I know." June looked at me for a moment in the way that people who pay attention look at you when they are reading more than what you have said. She said, "It's a good thing, is all. For both of them." I said, "Yes, it is." She returned to her own conversation. I returned to mine. The structure held. I let it. Saturday morning came the way October mornings on the coast do, first gray, then something between gray and gold that is more beautiful than either, and impossible to photograph accurately. I was in Mira's suite by 7 o'clock, because I was the maid of honor, and that was my post, and the suite was already full of the orchestrated energy of a bride who had decided today would be perfect, and was communicating this decision to the universe through the intensity of her attention to each detail. The stylist was setting up. A second woman from the hotel had brought a breakfast tray that no one was eating, because the energy in the room was the kind that comes before important things, when the body understands it is operating under elevated conditions and redirects the usual appetites accordingly. The morning had the specific texture of a beginning, all the charged, deliberate anticipation of a day that has been planned for months, finally arriving at its own threshold. Mira came out of the bathroom. She was wearing a cream robe, hair down, face clean before the makeup work began. She was beautiful in the unguarded way. She was beautiful when she was not performing anything, which was also, as always, a complicated thing for me to observe, because looking at my twin was looking at a version of myself that had made different choices, and sometimes those choices read as a mirror rather than a person. We had both spent our whole lives learning to see the distinction. She sat in the styling chair. And here was the first thing I did not know how to account for. She was quiet. Mira was never quiet before something important. She processed the world in motion and in language, working through the texture of any significant moment out loud, until it became manageable. Before her college graduation, she talked for 3 hours. Before our father's funeral, she talked all night. Before the engagement dinner, she called me 6 times in 48 hours. Each call a slightly different iteration of the same anxiety approached from a new angle. She was sitting in the styling chair in the particular stillness of someone who has already made a decision, and the decision is inside her like a stone, and there is nothing left to process because the processing was done somewhere else, without witnesses, over a period of time that I was only now beginning to suspect had been very long. I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Of course." I said, "You're quiet." She said, "I'm being still. You're always telling me to be still." I said, "I know. It looks different on you." She met my eyes in the mirror. Her face was my face, arranged around something I could not read, which was new. I had always been able to read her. It was one of the specific compensations of having a face identical to another person's. You learned, over time, to see the tiny variations in expression that no one else could distinguish, the microscopic differences that added up to the whole truth. The thing on her face, I could not read. I said, "Mira." She said, "Go get us coffee. You're doing the hovering thing." I went. I was gone 7 minutes. I know this because I counted them on the walk back, the way I count things when something in me is paying closer attention than I want to admit. I came back and she was gone. The stylist was in the hallway, looking uncertain. The suite door was open. The room was empty except for the morning light and the dress on its hanger and the specific, particular stillness of a space that has recently been vacated by a person who was never coming back to it. I set the coffee cups on the console table. I went into the bathroom. The ring was on the counter beside the soap dish. Her engagement ring, the thin band with the oval stone that Briar had given her, the one Mira had described to me the night of the proposal in the specific private language twins use when they are sharing something real. I had listened to that description for 20 minutes. I had been very good at listening. Beside the ring was her phone. I picked up the ring. I held it in my palm. The bathroom was impersonally clean, the smell of it antiseptic and cold and wrong for a room that had been full of sound 30 minutes ago. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face looked back at me, Mira's face, because that is the thing I had been living inside for 32 years. Then the phone lit up. Briar Calloway. The name appeared on the screen the same way it always appeared to me, with that small, precise internal thing I had learned to intercept before it could become anything I could not take back. I had been intercepting it for 18 months with the diligence of someone who understood that interception was the only responsible option. The message said, "Be down in 5. I ordered coffee. Miss you already." I stood in that hotel bathroom for a very long time. Miss you already. 4 words, and they landed with a weight entirely disproportionate to their size, because Briar Calloway was not a woman who wasted words. 18 months had taught me this completely. Every conversation I had observed between her and Mira, every comment she had made at family dinners or weekend visits or the birthday party where she had stood in my family's backyard in a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled and talked to my mother about the garden with the specific, genuine attention she brought to everything, all of it had taught me that Briar meant exactly what she said. No more, no less. Miss you already, when you have been in the same building for 3 days and have 4 hours until you stand in front of everyone you love and become each other's permanent fact, means something very specific from a woman who does not waste words. I picked up the phone. I picked up the ring. I put both in my pocket. I went back into the suite and looked at the dress on its hanger for a moment. It was ivory silk, perfectly fitted, and it was not going anywhere today. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. I told myself, the entire way down, that I was going to explain. That I was going to walk to wherever Briar was sitting with 2 cups of coffee and I was going to say, "I'm not Mira. I'm Asha. Something is wrong. I don't know where she went." That was what I was going to do. The elevator opened onto the lobby and I stepped out and I saw her immediately. Briar Calloway was sitting in the armchairs near the window that looked over the bluff and the water. And she was wearing a dark suit because she always wore a dark suit when there was a reason to, and the October morning light was coming through the glass, the way it comes through old windows, slightly warmer than the outside air deserved, doing something specific to the room that made everything in it look more considered than it was. She had 2 cups of coffee on the low table in front of her, and she was looking at her phone, and she was the most composed person I had ever seen in any room, and I had been watching her be composed for 18 months, and it had never stopped landing with the same weight. She looked up when I crossed the lobby toward her. She saw me. Her face did the thing it always did when she saw Mira, opened, slightly, in the way very controlled faces open when they are in the presence of something they trust completely. It was a single second. Most people would have missed it entirely. I had been cataloging her seconds for 18 months with the precision of someone who had nothing else to do with the information. She started to say something, probably Mira's name, probably with that particular warmth she gave it, the warmth of a word said so many times it has become its own kind of home. Something in my face stopped her. She looked at me, her head tilted 1 degree. She said, "Asha." It was not a question. I don't know how she knew. We were identical. We had been fooling people for 32 years, including people who had known us both for decades. But she said Asha without hesitation, 1 second before I could say a word, and I stopped in front of her and understood that Briar Calloway had apparently been paying enough attention to know the difference. I said, "I need to tell you something." She stood, not urgently, immediately. the motion of someone who has read a room in under a second and understood that what is coming requires her to be on her feet for it. Her face had not changed, but the openness was gone. The composure had returned to its full operational height, which was the most formidable version of Briar Calloway. And also, I had come to understand, the version she deployed when she needed to hold something very heavy without dropping it. "What?" she said. I said. I went to bring her coffee, and she was gone. Her ring was on the bathroom counter. Her phone was beside it. A silence. The lobby moved around us, a bellhop crossing with a cart, 2 women at the front desk, the ambient sound of a hotel morning that had no idea what it was in the middle of. Briar looked at me. She counted something behind her eyes. She said, "How long ago?" I said, 20 minutes. Maybe 25. She said, "Has she contacted you?" I said, "Not on my phone. I have her phone." She said, "Is there anything in the room that would tell us where she went?" I said, "I didn't look carefully. I came down when I found the phone." She said, "Let's go look." She picked up both coffee cups from the table. Both of them. She held them with the efficient economy she brought to everything and walked with me toward the elevator without another word. This was, I had learned, how Briar moved through crisis. She identified the next necessary step and moved toward it, without performing distress, without narrating what she was doing or why. In the elevator, she handed me one of the cups. My hands were colder than I had realized. The coffee was very warm. I wrapped both palms around it and said nothing. She looked at the numbers. Her jaw was set, the jaw flex that I had learned to watch, the one that was the closest she came to showing distress in public. It was barely there. It was there. I said, "Briar." She looked at me. I said, "I'm sorry." She looked back at the numbers. She said, "Not yet. Let's see what we're looking at first." I understood this to mean, do not offer me comfort until we know what we are actually dealing with, because comfort before knowledge is just another kind of lying, and lying was the only thing she could not tolerate. We went back to the suite. Briar moved through the rooms with a systematic attention that I recognized as the architectural side of her. She assessed spaces the way she assessed structures, looking for what they were actually saying rather than what they appeared to say. She checked the closet. She noted what was missing. She went into the bathroom more carefully than I had. She came out with a folded piece of hotel notepaper. The letterhead was gray at the top. The handwriting was Mira's. I knew my twin's handwriting in my bones, had known it since we first learned letters in the same kitchen at the same table, and seeing it there in Briar's hands did something to the air in the room. Briar read it. She read it once, then again. Her face was nothing. Absolute. Whatever was on the page, she had arranged herself around it before she had finished reading, which was either the most extraordinary self-control I had ever witnessed or the specific quality of devastation that comes when a person has, at some level, been waiting for a particular piece of paper without knowing they were waiting. She folded it again, set it on the console table, picked up her coffee, drank from it. She said, "She's not coming back today." I said nothing. She said, "There's a name, someone she's been seeing, someone who isn't me. She says she's been with this person for 4 months. She says she is in love with them, in a way she describes as a pause, as something she couldn't stop." The room held the quiet. I said, "Briar." She held up one hand. Not dismissal. A request for 30 seconds. I gave her 30 seconds. I gave her whatever she needed. I stood in the bridal suite of the Alderton Hotel with a cup of coffee and watched the most composed person I knew absorb the information that her wedding was not happening today and had not been going to happen today. Not really. Not for at least 4 months. She said, "How many people are downstairs?" I thought about the schedule. Guests starting to arrive by 11. It was 10:20. The ceremony was at 2. So, some family. The wedding party from both sides, their mother, Della, the coordinator, who needed to be found immediately. I said, "Some family, the coordinator, the ceremony isn't until 2, she said. "Then we have time to manage this." She looked at me. In the morning light, with the composure fully operational and the jaw doing the thing it did, she was something I did not have the right to observe as closely as I was observing it. I made myself look at the floor instead. She said, "I need to make 2 calls. Then we find Della." She made the calls behind the closed bathroom door. 8 minutes. Through it, I could hear the specific register of Briar Calloway conducting a crisis level, efficient, no excess in either direction. Just the transmission of accurate information to people who needed it, in the exact quantity required, without a single wasted syllable. When she came out, she looked precisely as she had when she went in. The composure was whole. The cost of maintaining it showed only at the absolute edges, if you knew exactly where to look, which I did, which was itself a problem. We found Della in the event coordinator's office off the lobby. Della was 32, and had been doing this long enough to have developed the specific pragmatic grace of someone who had seen everything go wrong at weddings, and understood that going wrong was not the end of anything only the beginning of a different version of the same day. She absorbed what Briar told her with one small flinch, just the barest intake of breath, and then she was already on the phone, already redirecting, already converting the machinery of a wedding into the machinery of its graceful dissolution with the organized efficiency of a professional who had clearly navigated this territory before. The guests were Briar's to manage. She was the one standing in the lobby at 11 as people arrived in their good clothes and their good intentions, and she was the one who said, with the specific measured clarity her voice defaulted to when she had decided not to waste words managing tone, "The wedding has been cancelled. Mira is not here. We are sorry for the inconvenience, and we hope you will stay for the lunch that has already been prepared." She said it 16 times. To 16 different groupings of people in various states of confusion and sympathy and shock. She said it with the same level attention every time, without additional explanation, without emotional coloring, without performing either grief or composure. The composure was simply what she was. I stood to her left, and slightly behind her through each of the 16 conversations, and watched the thing it cost her, and did not look away. Twice, people hugged her. She received the hugs with the still, careful attention she brought to physical contact present inside each one, not leaning into it, not pulling away. Like someone who had learned that comfort was a thing to be accepted gracefully, rather than something to seek. My mother found me at the edge of the lobby after the 7th conversation. She pulled me aside with the specific, small authority of her hand on my arm that had been the same since I was a child. She said, "Asha, where is your sister?" I said, "She's gone, Mum. She left this morning." My mother looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at Briar across the lobby. She said, "That poor woman." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about this honestly. I was in a hotel lobby watching my twin sister's abandoned fiancé tell the same devastating news to their assembled families and friends for the 16th time, and I was holding the wedding ring in my pocket, and I was aware of every detail of every moment with the particular acuity that crisis gives you when it is not quite your own crisis and you have to keep functioning inside someone else's. I said, "I'm fine. Go sit with the others." She held my arm a moment longer. She said, "Stay close to her. She should not be alone today." I said, "I know." I stayed close. By 12 o'clock the lobby had cleared into the dining room, where the wedding lunch was being served with a determination on Della's part that I respected more than I could say. The tables were beautiful. The flowers were arranged in the way they had been planned to be arranged, because no one had thought to redirect them, and because, as Della said quietly when I passed her near the kitchen corridor, beautiful tables did not make a cancelled wedding worse, and they might make the next few hours slightly more survivable for the people sitting at them. Briar was not at the tables. I found her on the terrace that ran along the back of the hotel, overlooking the bluff and the ocean. The October wind was off the water, and it was cold enough that her jacket was insufficient for it. But she was standing at the railing with both hands resting on the stone and looking at the ocean with an attention that had nothing to do with the view. I went and stood beside her. "Not too close. Close enough." She said, "You don't have to stay out here." I said, "I know." A pause. The water was dark green in the cloud light, moving in the long, slow swells that this part of the coast produced in autumn. A pair of birds was working the updrafts at the edge of the bluff. She said, "Did you know?" I said, "No." She said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure." She didn't tell me. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. She thought about this. She said, "Worse, probably. It means she knew what telling me would require. She didn't want that conversation." I said nothing, because she was right, and saying so would not help. She said, 4 months. 4 months and she was still here, still letting me send invitations and confirm the venue and consult about flowers and arrange travel for people coming from 4 different cities. 4 months of that and she was already somewhere else. The wind came off the water and moved through the space between us, and I could smell the salt of it, and something else cedar, and something lighter underneath it, which was briars, which I had been filing under things not to notice for 18 months. She said, "I keep waiting to feel something that makes sense." I said, "What do you feel right now?" She turned her head and looked at me. In the cloud light, with her hair moving slightly in the wind, and the jacket insufficient, and the composure doing something it did not usually do, holding itself at a careful distance from what was underneath, rather than being the same thing as what was. Underneath she looked like a woman who had stopped needing the wall to be indistinguishable from herself. She said, "Mostly like, I can't remember how to breathe without thinking about it." I said, "That sounds right." She looked back at the water. She said, "I loved her. I was not constructing something useful out of convenience or proximity. I genuinely loved her." I said, "I know." She said, "That's the part it's not the wedding, not the day, the arrangements, any of this. It's that she was actually someone I loved, and she was somewhere else for 4 months, and she never once gave me the opportunity to." She stopped. She said, "She just left." I said, "Yes, that's what she did." She said, "You sound like you've been thinking about how to explain her." I said, "I've been thinking about several things out here." A small pause. She said, "You're doing the twin thing." I said, "The twin thing?" She said, "You look like her but you don't feel like her. It's in the specific way you hold still. She was never still like this. You've always been the still one." The ring was in my pocket. I was aware of its weight there, the way you are aware of things that do not belong where they are. I said, "She used to say the same. That I was the one who knew how to stop." Briar turned back to the water. She said, "Did you know I was nervous about this weekend?" I said, "No." She said, "I don't get nervous. It's not a register I operate in. But this particular weekend I was. Not about marrying her, about the scale of it. Being visible in all the ways a wedding requires visibility." I said, "And?" She said, "She always knew, from early on, that I was better in small spaces than large ones, that I do my best work quietly. She told me at the engagement dinner she had planned this weekend, so there would always be one small thing inside the large thing. One conversation, one window, one terrace." I waited. She said, "And she was right. There is a terrace." The wind again, cold and specific, and coming off something large and indifferent that had no idea it was being asked to carry anything. She said, "But she's not here." I said, "No." She said, "You are." I did not say anything to this. I had gotten extremely good at not saying the things I was not supposed to say. The structure had held for 18 months. It would hold now. She turned from the railing. She said, "I'm going to go back inside and thank the people who came and eat the food and get through the rest of today. And tomorrow I'm going to drive home. And after that, I don't know." I said, "I'll drive you." She looked at me. I said, "Tomorrow, I'll drive you home." She was quiet for a moment. The quality of the quiet was different from refusal. She said, "You have your own car." I said, "I can come back for it." She said, "That's..." I said, "You're not driving home alone the morning after your wedding was cancelled. That's not something I'm willing to let happen." A pause. Something in the set of her shoulders shifted, not relaxing exactly, but redistributing. The way a structure adjusts when something external takes a share of the load. She said, Asha. I said, yes. She said, you are very different from her. I said, I know. She said, I meant it as something good. I said, I know that too. She went inside. I stayed at the railing for several more minutes and said everything I was not allowed to say to the ocean, which is what I had always used for that purpose. The afternoon was long. Briar moved through it with the same composure she had brought to every other part of the day, receiving condolences with a gracious deflection that was entirely in service of the people offering them rather than herself. June stayed close to her throughout, the kind of proximity that comes from 15 years of practice and genuine love. June was warm and easy, and occasionally said something quiet that made the very edge of Briar's mouth move. And I was grateful for June in the way you are grateful for the people who know how to be useful to the people you care about. I helped Della manage the afternoon logistics. We redirected the flower arrangements. We arranged for out-of-town guests to receive an additional night with Briar's family's compliments. We processed the administrative aftermath of a cancelled wedding with the focused efficiency of two people who had decided that doing things was better than feeling things, for the time being. At 6 o'clock, when the lobby had mostly emptied, and the dining room was down to a handful of family, Della found me by the elevator. She looked at me with the professional curiosity of someone who has spent a decade reading the emotional weather of difficult events. She said, "You're handling this remarkably well." I said, "Someone has to." She said, "The other one," she gestured toward wherever Briar was, "is a different kind of remarkable. I've done this for 10 years. I have never seen someone absorb that particular piece of news in that particular context and remain that functional." I said, "She's always been like that." Della looked at me in a way that suggested she had registered more from that sentence than I had intended to put in it. She said, "Ah, yes, of course." She excused herself diplomatically. I found Briar at 8 o'clock in the suite, the bridal suite, which the hotel had given her alone for the night, because no one at the Alderton was going to ask for that room back today. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in the dim light, jacket off, shoes beside the nightstand, the folded note from Mira on the console table across the room. She had not unfolded it again. She was simply sitting with it in her line of sight. The way you sit with something that has cost you a great deal and you are not ready to put it away. I knocked on the open door. She looked up. I said, "Have you eaten anything since the coffee this morning?" She said, "I had something at lunch." I said, "Something is not a meal." She said, "I'm not particularly hungry." I said, "That's not the question I asked." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I did not have a category for yet. She said, "Fine." I ordered from room service. Bread and soup and a bowl of fruit. I set up the small table by the window while we waited, because eating at the bedside table felt wrong in a way I could not entirely articulate, and the window looked out over the water, and the water was doing something useful with the night, dark and vast, and entirely unconcerned with what was happening in this room, which was a specific kind of comfort. When the food arrived, she ate. Steadily, without enthusiasm, in the way people eat when they are being careful about themselves despite not wanting to be. I ate too. The window showed the ocean at night, which is different from the ocean in the day, darker, more absolute, with the faint running light of a ship far out on the horizon that moved too slowly to catch, unless you looked away and then looked back. She said, eventually, "How many times did you meet her?" "The person Mira was seeing." I said, "I don't know who it is." She said, "The note had a name." I said, "She didn't tell me. I mean it. This is not something she would have told me." Briar was quiet. She said, "You would have said something." I said, "Yes, I would have." She said, "I know." We sat with that for a moment. She said, "She used to say you were the honest one, that you couldn't sustain a lie longer than about 48 hours before it became physically uncomfortable." I said, "She wasn't wrong." She said, "No." Another pause. She said, "I've been trying to understand whether I missed something, whether there was something I should have seen, whether I was." She stopped. I said, "Don't do that accounting." She looked at me. I said, "Don't make yourself the reason she made the choice she made. You didn't miss anything that was yours to miss. She chose not to tell you. She chose not to tell anyone. Whatever she was doing, it belonged to her, not to any failure of your attention. Her hands were around the water glass. She looked at them. She said, "That's a generous reading." I said, "It's the accurate one." She was quiet. Outside, the ship on the horizon had moved enough to be in a slightly different place. She said, "Asha." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you go down this morning?" The question landed with more weight than its 4 words held. Because it was the right question, and Briar had always asked the right questions. I said, "Because the text said miss you already, and I thought if Briar Calloway misses someone that much 4 hours before a wedding, someone should be there to tell her the truth. Even if the truth is the worst version of the day." She looked at me. For a long time she looked at me, with those clear, assessing eyes that had always made me feel very precisely seen, and very precisely aware of why being seen by her was a complicated thing to experience. She said, "That was kind." I said, "It felt necessary." She said, "Those aren't different things." She stood and went to the window and looked out at the water. I stayed at the table and looked at the breadcrumbs on the plate and waited. She said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "Did you know?" Not about the person she was seeing. The other thing, did you know how she stopped? She started again. "Did you know how much I said, "I knew you loved her." "Yes." It was visible. It was always visible to me. A pause. She said, "That's what I thought." She turned around. In the low lamplight, with the composure doing something different than it usually did, not holding, exactly, just present. Just a woman, in a room, at the end of the longest day anyone had ever constructed for her. She looked like someone who had stopped building and started simply standing in the space. She said, "There is something I am not going to say tonight." I said, "Okay." She said, "Not because I don't, because tonight is not the right time, and I know the difference between something that is real and something that is a response to a day like this one. And I am going to be honest about that distinction even when it costs me something to be honest about it. Especially then." I said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" I said, "Yes. I understand exactly what you're not saying, and I understand why tonight is not the right time, and I think you're right to hold it." She looked at me. She said, "You are very different from her." I said, "You said that already." She said, "It bears repeating." I started clearing the table. She watched me do it. Neither of us said anything else. I said, "Get some sleep. I'll be in the room next door." She said, "You really don't have to stay." I said, "I know." I left the ring on the console table before I left. I set it beside the folded note without a word, because it was not mine to carry home, and because leaving it there felt like the only honest thing to do with something that had never belonged to me. In my own room, I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. I thought about what she had not said. I thought about 18 months of building load-bearing structure around something I had no right to feel, and about how the load had shifted tonight without anyone asking my permission, and about what it meant that the most composed person I had ever known had looked at me across a hotel table at the end of a devastating day and said, "There is something real, and tonight is not the time." I thought about the word real. I thought about June at the rehearsal dinner. Briar does not say things she does not mean. She had said, "Something real." I lay in the dark and let it be true and did not do anything with it, because tonight was not the time, and she was right about that, and the best thing I could do for both of us was to understand the difference between what was real and what was ready. Tomorrow, I would drive her home. That was the next true thing. Everything after that could wait until she was not breaking. I did not sleep well. I did not expect to. I lay in the dark of the room next door and listened to the Alderton doing what old hotels do at night, the particular deep breathing of plumbing and timber and the accumulated weight of all the things that have happened inside a building over 100 years, and I held the word real in the part of my mind where I had been keeping the structure, and let it settle beside everything else that was stored there, and waited for morning. Morning came the way mornings come after difficult nights, without any particular generosity, just the return of light through the curtains and the ambient sounds of the hotel resuming its day. I showered and dressed and knocked on Briar's door at 7:15. She opened it immediately. She had also not slept particularly well. I could see it in the specific way the composure was assembled, with slightly more intention than it usually required. She was dressed. Dark trousers, a gray shirt, her hair half back, in a way that suggested she had started to put it up and then stopped midway through the motion. She was carrying a cup of coffee that had been made from the in-room machine, and she was holding it with both hands. She looked at me. She said, "I'll be checked out in 10 minutes. I said, "Take your time." She said, 10 minutes. She was checked out in 8. I was at the front desk waiting with my own bag and a receipt when she came through the lobby with her coat over her arm and her suitcase and nothing else. The folded note from Mira was not visible. She had dealt with the note the way she dealt with everything she had decided to absorb and put away privately, completely, without asking anyone to witness the handling of it. The ring, I noticed, was not on the console table when I had looked in one final time before closing my own door. She had taken it. I did not know what she would do with it, and I did not ask. We gave her car to the valet to bring around. While we waited, we stood in the early morning outside the Alderton, with the ocean below the bluff and the particular smell of coastal October salt and cut grass and the very faint, clean chill that is specific to mornings at altitude above water. The sky was the flat, honest gray of a day that has not yet decided what it intends to do. She said, "I can drive." I said, "I'm driving." She said, "You don't." I said, "I know." She let me. The car was an hour old before either of us said anything that was not navigational. She sat in the passenger seat with her coat folded in her lap and her hands around her coffee from a petrol station just outside town, and she watched the coast road and its specific long views without saying anything, and I drove and did not try to fill the silence because the silence was not empty. She said, eventually, "Where do you live? I mean, where in the city? I've always come to you through Mira." I said, "East Side, near the canal." She said, "I didn't know that." I said, "We haven't had much occasion to discuss it." A pause. She said, "No, we haven't." She turned her head and looked at me briefly. Not long enough to be an assessment, long enough to be a question she had not yet found the words for. She said, "What do you do?" Again, I know the answer, but I know it through Mira. I said, "Graphic design, primarily book covers and editorial. Occasionally, installation work when someone asks nicely." She said, "Installation." I said, "Large format, public-facing. The kind of work that has to read from 100 meters away, which means every decision needs to account for distance." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's interesting." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because that's essentially what structural architecture is. The constraint that every decision has to remain legible at the human scale, regardless of how large the thing is. The building that works at street level and at the horizon simultaneously." I said, "I had not thought about it that way." She said, "I have been thinking about it for the past 30 minutes. I let that sit. She said, "You have been looking at things from a distance for a long time. As a professional method," I said, "and as a personal one." She looked at me. Not briefly this time. She said, "Yes, I noticed that." She turned back to the road and said nothing else for a while. I drove. The coast curved away, and we moved inland through hills that were the particular tawny gold of October in this part of the country, and the light changed as we went, and the car was warm, and she fell asleep somewhere, around the second hour, without announcing that she was going to. I drove with Briar Calloway asleep in the passenger seat for an hour and 10 minutes, and understood, in a way I had been managing not to understand for 18 months, that the thing I had been building structure around was not going away. It had been there in October a year ago, when she talked to me about load-bearing walls over Christmas breakfast. It would be there after today. It was not going anywhere. I was 32 years old, and I had been paying very careful, very detailed attention to someone I was not allowed to be paying that quality of attention to. And the not allowed had dissolved, not neatly, not pleasantly, not in any version I would have chosen, and what remained was simply the attention itself, with nothing left to intercept it. I let her sleep for an hour. When she woke, she made no comment about having fallen asleep, which was its own small intimacy, the absence of apology, the assumption that the car was a space where sleep was permitted. She said, "How far?" I said, "About an hour." She said, "I'll make lunch when we arrive, if you'll stay." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." We talked for the last hour about things I had not expected to talk about: a project she was finishing, a building in the Harbor District that had been designed badly in the 70s and was now being rehabilitated with what she described as painstaking structural honesty. She talked about it the way she talked about everything she cared about, precisely, with the underlying warmth of someone for whom precision was not coldness but respect. I asked questions. She answered them fully. By the time we reached her city, I had learned more about her than I had in 18 months of carefully maintained distance. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been a textile warehouse in the previous century, and it was exactly what I would have expected if I had allowed myself to imagine it: high ceilings, large windows, the bones of the original structure still visible in the beams, and the iron fittings. Everything in it had been chosen with care. Not expensive, exactly, but specific. The books on the shelves were organized in a way that had its own system. The kitchen table was old and solid and had clearly been a working table for a long time. There were drawings on the wall, not decorative prints, actual architectural drawings, framed. There were photographs on one shelf. I did not look at them directly, but I saw them in the way you see things when you are being careful not to look. Mira and Briar at what looked like a coastline, both laughing. Briar and June at a graduation or a formal event, older photo, edges slightly faded. Briar went to the kitchen and I sat at the table and looked at the drawings on the wall. She said, from the kitchen, without turning around, "The one in the center is the 1903 wing." I looked at it. It was a technical elevation drawing, precise and detailed, the kind of thing that existed before computer drafting: hand-ruled lines, careful notations in the margin, a scale bar along the bottom. She had framed it in plain dark wood. I said, "Where did you find it?" She said, "The county archive." 3 years ago, before Mira and I were." She paused. "Before. I found it and thought of the Alderton and had it framed." I said, "You went to the archive for it?" She said, "I was in the county for a project. It was not a special trip." She brought lunch to the table and we ate and talked about other things, and then I stood to go and she stood with me and we stood in her kitchen and I looked at her and said, "I'll drive back for my car this week." She said, "There's no urgency." I said, "I know." She walked me to the door. At the door she did something I was not expecting. She put her hand briefly on my arm, the same place my mother had, the specific, authoritative small pressure of someone saying, "I see you," without saying it. It lasted 1 second. She removed it. She said, "Thank you." I said, "You said that already." She said, "I know. It's still true." I went down 4 flights of stairs and out through the old textile warehouse lobby and into the street and stood in the October afternoon and breathed the city air and let the thing in my chest be what it was, since there was nobody watching and the structure, at this particular moment, was not required. Then I walked to the station and took the train home. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That was perhaps the strangest thing about them, how ordinary they were, relative to what had happened. Mira texted me eventually, 2 weeks after the wedding. That wasn't a long and carefully composed message that was honest in a way I had not expected from her, and which told me, more than anything, that she had known exactly what she was doing, and had not found a way to be brave about it until she had already done the irreversible thing. I read it 3 times. I texted back a single paragraph. We did not speak on the phone. My mother called me weekly. She was managing, in the way my mother managed things, with the yellow house luck philosophy applied to disaster, which meant finding the small functional things and tending them until the larger picture became legible again. She asked about Briar in these calls. I told her I had driven her home. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good girl." I drove back to the Alderton on a Wednesday to collect my car. I chose a weekday so the hotel would be quiet, so there would be none of the residue of that particular weekend still visible in the car parks and the lobby. The building looked the same. The bluff looked the same. The ocean was doing something different with the light the week had turned, and November was arriving, and I stood beside my car for a moment and looked at the water and said nothing to it, because I had already said everything to it that needed saying. And now I was just a person looking at the ocean on a Wednesday. I texted Briar, back at the Alderton, car collected. Hope the week has been manageable. She texted back, the week has been accurate, thank you for driving. I looked at this for a moment. Accurate. It was the kind of word she used when precise was what she meant, rather than good. I wrote back, let me know if you need anything. She wrote, yes. That was all. It was somehow enough. In the third week, June called. I almost didn't answer because I did not recognize the number. And then I did, and I sat down at my desk at the particular quality of attention that June's name produced. She said, Asha. I hope you don't mind. Briar gave me your number. Which itself is a piece of information. I said, hello June. She said, I'm going to say something that isn't entirely my business to say, and I'm going to trust you to do the right thing with it. I said, all right. She said, she's doing better than anyone expected. Not performed better, actually better. She is the kind of person who does the real work when the real work is required, and she is doing it. But she has been, she paused. She's been asking about you, not about Mira, about you, in the specific way she asks about things that matter to her. I was quiet for a moment. I said, she said it wasn't the right time. June said, she said a lot of things, she's still saying this one. I said, what do you mean? She said, I mean, she says you're not the right time, and then she asks me if I know what you're working on. I mean, she says it's complicated, and then I catch her looking at something she's going to send you and she closes the tab. I mean, she has been telling me for 3 weeks that she needs to do the real work before she is fair to you, and she is doing the real work, and I think she is closer to fair than she knows. I said nothing. June said, I don't know what happened on that terrace, or at dinner, or wherever it happened. She hasn't told me, and she won't, because she keeps the things that matter to her very close. But I know Briar Calloway, and I know when something has started in her, and this one started a long time ago, and she is only now letting herself look at it. I said, she told me she knows the difference between something real and something that's a response to what happened. June said, yes, she said the same to me, verbatim. I said, do you believe her? June said, I believe that she is the most honest person I know, and that she would not say the word real unless she had already checked it 3 times. A silence. June said, I'm not telling you to go to her. I'm not even telling you to wait. She builds things slowly, and they hold. Whatever she is building toward you, let her take the time to do it right. That's the Briar I know. That's the Briar you're going to get. I said, I know. She said, yes, I think you do. She said goodbye, and I sat at my desk with my phone in my hand and looked at the canal out the window and thought about foundations and what it took to build one correctly. 5 weeks after the wedding, I drove to her city. I told myself it was to return a coat of Mira's that had been in my back seat since the summer. This was true. The coat was in a bag in my back seat. But it was also not the reason I was driving to her city on a Saturday morning in November, with the particular alertness of someone who has been making a decision for 5 weeks and has finally made it. She opened the door when I knocked. She was in dark jeans and a wool pullover, her hair down, fully down, not half up, not caught at the back. She was holding a pen, which meant I had interrupted something she was working on, which meant she was working on a Saturday morning, which was something she apparently did. She looked at me. She read me the way she always read me, quickly and completely and without asking clarifying questions. She stepped back to let me in. I handed her the coat. She took it and set it on the chair by the door and said nothing about the coat, which confirmed that we were both aware the coat was not the point. We made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, her table. The old solid one, and the November light came through the tall windows, and the apartment was warm, and the tea was very good, and neither of us said anything for approximately 4 minutes. Then I said, June called me. She said, I know. I asked her to. I looked at her. She said, I thought you deserved to know where I was without me having to be the one to say it before I was ready to say it. That was the best I could do. I said. She said you've been building towards something. She looked at her tea. She said, I have been trying to understand what I am building toward so that when I tell you accurately. I said, and? She looked up. She said, and I need more time. Not because she stopped. She said, I need you to understand what I'm asking for, and why. I said, all right. She said, you went down to the lobby on a Saturday morning to tell someone a terrible thing because a text message said, miss you already, and you thought she deserved someone to be there. That is the kind of person you are. That has been the kind of person you have always been, and I have been aware of it, specifically aware of it, in the way I'm aware of the things that matter. I said, Briar. She said, I'm not done. I waited. She said, I do not want to be the woman who reached for you because she was broken and you were the one who stayed. I do not want what I feel for you to be made of what Mira did, or what this month has been, or the way you have shown up in every practical and honest way since that morning and made the showing up look effortless. I want it to be made of you. Specifically you. And I need enough time and enough honest thinking to be certain it is. I said, how certain? She said, certain enough that when I tell you, you can believe me. I said, and you're not there yet. She said, I'm closer than I was 4 weeks ago. I am not there yet. I looked at her across the table. She met my eyes with the composure that was real, and the vulnerability that was also real, and the specific integrity of a woman who had decided that honesty was the only foundation worth building on, even when honesty was the more expensive option. I said, I have been not saying something to you for 18 months. She said, I know. I said, I'm not going to say it yet either. But I want you to know it exists, and that it has been there longer than this month, and longer than this weekend, and that it is not made of what Mira did. It predates Mira, by a significant margin. She looked at me. I said, that's all I'll say. Take whatever time you need. A pause. She said, thank you. I said, thank you for being honest about what you need instead of just doing what was easier. She said, the easier thing would have been, she stopped. She said, the easier thing would have been to let you say the thing you've been not saying and receive it and not think too hard about whether I was ready or why. I said, yes. She said, I am not willing to be easy with you. I understood this to mean, I am not willing to do this carelessly. It was the most precise thing she had said to me in 5 weeks of careful, calibrated contact. I left the coat. I drove home through the November gray, and I did not try to feel the drive as a defeat because it was not a defeat. It was a woman who had decided to be honest with me and a version of myself that had decided to be patient, and those were both correct decisions, and the time between them was not lost time. It was simply the time it took. December arrived. Asha's work filled the gap the way work does when you let it not as distraction exactly, but as a container for the energy that did not have anywhere else to go. I finished 2 cover projects and started a 3rd. I took a long walk along the canal most mornings before it got properly light and watched the water be gray and useful and entirely disinterested in my interior life, which was a quality I had always appreciated in water. Briar and I texted, not every day, but with a regularity that was its own kind of language. She sent me a photograph in the 2nd week of December, the photograph of the Alderton's 1903 wing from a book, not the framed drawing, a different version of the same elevation from a different archive source. No message, just the image. I looked at it for a long time. I understood it to mean, I found another one. I thought of you. I am still thinking of you in the specific way that involves finding things and needing to share them. I texted back. The window proportions are different in this version. Wider by about 1/3. She texted back, the original design. They narrowed them during construction for structural reasons. The building was telling the architect something. I texted, did he listen? She texted, eventually. I held my phone and read that exchange 3 times. Then I put it down and went to make coffee, and told myself that patience was the only currency that was going to matter here, and that I had been building toward this for long enough that I could wait a little longer. January. The city in January was the kind of specific gray that felt like an instruction to be indoors and useful, and I was indoors and useful, and I stopped counting the weeks since October and started simply living inside whatever this was, this state of knowing something, not saying it, waiting for the right time to arrive. I did not know when February started. It arrived without announcement, the way months do when you are paying attention to something other than the calendar. She knocked on my door on a Sunday morning in February. I had not known she was coming. There had been no text. I opened the door in my oldest sweatshirt with my coffee, and the particular uncurated look of someone who has been working since 7, without thinking about how they appear, and she was standing in the hallway in a dark coat and dark jeans with her hair partially loose and a book under her arm. She said, "I was in your part of the city." I said, "You live 2 hours away." She said, "I was in your part of the city anyway." I stepped back and let her in. She looked around my apartment in the particular way she looked at spaces, assessing, cataloging, understanding the structure behind the surface. The apartment was not dressed for company. It was the real version, which meant the canal out the window and the books in their own system along the walls and the drawing board in the corner with the current project spread across it. She went to the drawing board. She looked at the project, a cover for a novel, in the early stage where everything was still fragments and possibility. She said, "You work from distance even at scale 0. I said, "Old habits." She said, "It works." She turned around. She set the book on my kitchen table. I saw it was the book with the alternate Alderton elevation photograph, the one she had texted me the image from. She had brought me the book. She said, "I came to give you that, and to say something." I said, "All right." She said, "Sit down." I sat at the kitchen table. She sat across from me, coat still on, hands on the table. The morning was doing the February thing with the light pale, careful, offering exactly enough to see by and nothing extra. She said, "I told you in November that I needed enough time and enough honest thinking to be certain. I have had 4 months of both. I want to tell you what I found." I said nothing. I let her have the room. She said, "I found that I have been paying the specific kind of attention to you that I reserve for things I cannot afford to get wrong. Since October of last year, not this October, the one before it, the month after you came to the birthday party and asked me about the garden and then listened to the answer for 20 minutes while Mira was inside finding drinks. I stayed very still." She said, "I did not name it. I am not someone who names things before I understand them, and I did not understand what I was paying attention to or why, but I was building something without knowing I was building. I was noting the way you held still in rooms, the way you asked questions and actually waited for the answers, the way you always said the accurate thing instead of the generous thing when the two were different, and trusted the other person to be able to hold accuracy." She looked at her hands. She said, "I want to tell you what it was like in that lobby when you walked across it. When I looked up and saw Mira's face and understood in the same second that it wasn't Mira, I recognized you, not in the way you recognize a face that looks like a face you know, in the way you recognize something you have been building toward without knowing it. The shape of it was already in me." I said, "You said my name before I could say a word." She said, "Yes." I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Because I have been paying that quality of attention to you for 13 months, and it had nowhere to go, and it had been accumulating in the way things accumulate when you refuse to examine them, and in that 1 second in the lobby it simply arrived. The way a structure arrives at completion, not dramatically, just becoming itself." The February light was doing something patient with the room. She said, "I am sorry that the situation that gave me the right to say this out loud was what it was. I am sorry that Mira did what she did, and I am sorry that you were in that bathroom alone with a ring that belonged to someone else and a phone that lit up with my name, and I am sorry that none of the other versions of this were available to us. This is the version we have, and this version is real. I have checked it enough times to be certain." I said, "Briar." She said, "Yes." I said, "I need you to know that what I feel for you is not made of this month or this year. It is made of a Christmas breakfast and 40 minutes of load-bearing walls and 18 months of building a structure around something I was not allowed to have and getting very, very good at maintenance. She looked at me. I said, I have been the still one my whole life, the one who watches from the right distance, the one who knows how to stop, and I have never in 32 years had so much difficulty stopping as I have had in the past 18 months in rooms that contained you. She said nothing. Her hands were still on the table. I said, I need you to know it predates October. I need you to know it is not made of Mira leaving. It is mine. It has been mine for a long time. She looked at me for a long measured moment. The composure was present. It was not a wall. It was simply how she held herself upright, and underneath it I could see, with the precision of someone who had been studying the specific frequency of her face for over a year, exactly what was in her. She said, I know. She said, I have been hoping that was true. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She did not move. She looked at our hands on the table, and I felt the careful, particular quality of her being, still not frozen, just present, the way she was present inside everything that mattered. I stood up. I came around the table. She turned in her chair to face me, and I stood in front of her, and I touched her jaw with one hand, warm skin, the line of the bone under my palm, and she looked up at me with those clear, assessing eyes that had been seeing me more accurately than anyone had ever seen me, and I kissed her. It was patient. It was not frantic, not desperate, not the compressed release of too much that had been held too long. It was the specific quality of something earned, the particular unhurriedness of an arrival that has taken the right amount of time to be ready and is finally here. She brought one hand up to my arm. Not pulling, just holding. The way you hold something you intend to keep. We stayed like that for a moment that was longer than a moment. When I pulled back, she looked at me with the composure rearranged around something new, something that was not, this time, a method of containment, but simply what was present in her face when she stopped managing what was present. She said, I would like to stay for a while. I said, yes. She said, I'll make breakfast. Your kitchen suggests you have bread and coffee and approximately nothing else. I said, the bread is good. She said, the bread is always the thing that matters. She took off her coat. She stayed for 4 hours. We made breakfast and she looked at the canal out the window, and I told her about the installation work I had been thinking about, a large format piece for a public building, something that had to function at street level and at a distance simultaneously. The architectural problem I had been turning over for months. She asked questions with the particular quality of attention that she brought to things she found genuinely interesting, which was the same quality she had brought to me for 18 months without either of us naming it. At noon, she put her coat back on and I walked her down to the street. On the pavement outside the textile warehouse, my building, old like hers, bones visible, she put her hands in her pockets and looked at me in the February light, with the composure that was real and the feeling under it that she had finally stopped treating as something to be managed. She said, Thursday. I said, Thursday what? She said, come for dinner on Thursday. The table is the right size for 2 and it always seemed like a waste with one. I said, you've been having dinner alone at a table that is the right size for 2. She said, I bought it that way. I thought I was buying it for, she stopped. She said, I bought it for the right reason, as it turns out. I simply did not know the right reason at the time. I said, Thursday? She said, yes. She walked down the street, and I watched her go, and neither of us turned back, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the specific quality of an ending that is actually a beginning, and I knew the difference because I had been paying close enough attention for long enough that I had learned to tell them apart. Thursday. Then the Thursday after that. Then the Thursdays stopped being numbered. By April it was not Thursdays. It was the canal on a Sunday morning and the architecture book she left on my drawing board and the specific good coffee she made in my kitchen with the focus she brought to everything she decided to do well. It was my hand on her arm on a Tuesday evening and the two of us walking somewhere that was not a destination so much as a direction, which was enough of a destination for now. It was June at a birthday dinner in May-June, seeing us walk in together and doing the smallest possible version of relief, a single relaxed breath, before she recovered her composure and came to embrace us both. She said, under her breath, to me, "I told you she builds things slowly and they hold." I said, "You were right." She said, "I usually am." "Don't tell Briar I said that." It was the Saturday in July when Mira called me. We talked for a long time, the longest we had talked since October, and it was uncomfortable in the places where honest conversations between twins are uncomfortable and real, in the places where they can only be real, and at the end she said, "Are you happy, Asha?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Because of?" And I said, she said, "Good, that's good." I think she meant it. I think she had enough honesty in her to mean it, which was something. It was October again, 1 year after the ring on the bathroom counter, 1 year after the lobby, and the note, and the terrace, and the room service dinner, and the word real held in the dark, when Briar's firm held their annual gathering at a space in the Harbor District. The rehabilitated warehouse she had described on the drive home, the one that had been designed badly in the 70s and was being given back its structural honesty. It was finished. We went together. The building was extraordinary. She had not overstated it on the drive. It did exactly what she had described. It worked at street level and at the horizon simultaneously. It was legible at every distance. It held the specificity of its own history, without pretending that history was something other than what it was. I stood inside it with her and looked up at the roof structure, and felt the particular quality of being in a space that had been rebuilt from the bones with complete integrity. She said, "The bones were always right. It was the choices layered on top of them that had to be corrected." I said, "The original structure was sound." She said, "Yes, you just had to get back to it." She was looking at the roof. I was looking at her. She turned. She saw me looking at her. Something in the set of her mouth moved the corner of it, barely, the 1 millimeter I had been cataloging since before I was allowed to catalog it. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing. The building is remarkable." She said, "Yes." She took my hand. We stood in the rebuilt warehouse in the Harbor District with the October evening light coming through the windows that were the original proportion, not the narrowed construction version, the real version, the one that had been in the drawings all along, and neither of us said anything else. We were visible. There were 40 people in the building. Colleagues, clients, architects, the journalist who was writing about the rehabilitation. Neither of us moved. Neither of us managed our faces into anything other than what they were. The journalist found us near the windows at the far end. She said, "Can I ask what the building means to you? To Briar specifically, you were the lead architect on the rehabilitation." Briar said, "It means that the original decision was right, that the material was always capable of being what it was supposed to be. You simply had to be honest about what had been done to it and undo those things carefully, and then it could be itself." The journalist wrote something down. She looked at me. I was clearly not a colleague, clearly not a client, clearly something that required a different question. She said, "And you?" I said, "I'm a graphic designer. I work on things that have to be legible at a distance." She said, "And this? Does it work at a distance?" I looked at the building. Then I looked at Briar, who was already looking at me with those clear, patient, precise eyes. I said, "Yes, it works at every distance." The journalist moved on. Briar looked at me for a moment. She said, "That was the most public thing you have ever said." I said, "I know." She said, "How does it feel?" I said, "Like something that is exactly the right size for the space it is in." She said, "That's an architect's answer." I said, "I've been picking things up." She said nothing. She did the thing with the corner of her mouth again. She still wears dark suits when there is a reason to. She still has the precise, economical way of moving through a room that makes everything around her seem like it has been put in order by her presence. She still speaks in complete sentences and means exactly what she says, no more and no less. She comes for the canal on Sundays. She brings the right coffee. She leaves books on my drawing board and takes mine without asking, And we have had the argument about the correct organization of a shared bookshelf 3 times, and arrived at 3 different agreements, all of which she considers provisional, and I consider ongoing. At Christmas, I gave her a drawing, a hand-rendered elevation of the 1903 wing, made to the same scale as the framed technical drawing she keeps above her kitchen table. I drew it from the alternate archive photograph she texted me in December. The proportions were the original ones, the wider windows that had been narrowed during construction for structural reasons. She held it for a long time. She said, "The original proportions." I said, "The building was telling the architect something." Eventually, he listened. She looked at me. She said, "You have been paying attention for a very long time." I said, "Yes." She said, "To everything." I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." I said, "Thank you for letting me." She hung it beside the other one. On the wall of the apartment, where the light in winter comes through the tall windows and falls across the table that had always been the right size for 2. We sat at that table in the December morning and drank coffee and said things about things, and did not need to name what we were to each other, because we had been naming it correctly from the beginning, one thing at a time, one word at a time. Each piece costing something and being paid for honestly. The ring, she told me in January, she had given to a jeweler she trusted and asked them to melt it down and do something useful with the metal. She did not know what the jeweler had made of it. It did not matter. It had become something that was not a promise made by the wrong people for the wrong reasons, and that was a correct use of material that had always been sound. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about the morning I had held it in my palm in the hotel bathroom, and understood that it was still warm from her finger, and that I did not know what that meant. I know now. Some things tell you what they are, from the very beginning, in the specific, particular warmth of what they are holding. It simply takes the right amount of honesty, and the right amount of time, and the willingness to build slowly towards something that will hold. We are building slowly. It holds.